So today we are going to cover the absolute basics. What we're going to do is we're going to start a career on absolute normal difficulty, and I have one mod installed, and that one mod is Kerbal Engineer. Now we are going to do two things. We're going to start a career, and each step of the career I'm going to create a ship without Kerbal Engineer. Then I'm going to turn on Kerbal Engineer, show you how I would then optimize the ship knowing what Kerbal Engineer is telling me, and then we will launch the ship, and we will continue doing this until we progress through the career to the point where we have reached orbit and successfully returned from orbit. And this will be my tutorial for stock for 1.2.2, and I hope, given some time, that I can get this posted up on YouTube. So because of that, I am disabling host notifications and that kind of thing. I'm leaving the overlay on. We'll deal with that, but host notifications are temporarily turned off. I want to do absolute stock so that people who have it on the console can kind of see what I'm doing, but remember, people on console, you do not have 1.2.2. I don't remember exactly which version you guys are stuck on at the moment. I do know they're going to be fixing that, but for the moment, I believe you have like 1.1. So some of the things I'm doing may not be accurate for you on console, but at least it'll give you an idea of what we're doing. Also, we're going to be using Valentine, who's right here, for all of our launches because it's Valentine's Day. It is. And the one thing that I'm going to do that's not custom is, if you create the right image file and drop it into the Game Data Squad Flags folder, you can make it so that you always have your own little flag. And you can do a Google on how to do that. And someone made, I believe Pestrin made this flag for me. It's been a while. You can do a full career without it, without Kerbal Engineer. When I say it, oh, apparently we can still hear the notifications even if we can't see them. Oh, well, I'll just leave that up then. Anyway, so anytime you say him, he's a panda, that's a host notification. This has been recorded originally on Twitch Live. And we'll just get on with it. So, if you've never played the game before, you're presented with this screen. Each part of the astronaut complex, or launch facility, Kerbal Space Center in this case, is you can get to it through using these buttons over here, or by mousing over the various facilities. You've got your administration building, which is where you get to do not contracts, but strategies. That's a little more advanced than we're going to be covering today. The astronaut complex, which is where you hire new astronauts. Hopefully we won't need that today. The flagpole, which is where you can actually change the flag that you're using in your career. Not really that important for what we're doing today. The launchpad, this is where you launch your rockets from. Mission control, this is where you grab your contracts from. Research and development, that's where you pick up new technologies. The runway, this is the thing you avoid like the plague because it's too bumpy. The spaceplane hangar, that's where you make craft that use the runway that's too bumpy. By the way, I make this joke because in 1.2.3, they are apparently fixing the runway. So I can make a joke about it now because I know that they are planning on fixing it and have already fixed it in Q&A or something like that. This was mentioned on Boosters in Space Tape by one of my fellow podcasters, and I haven't looked at the notes, but I believe them. Tracking station, this is where you can go and pick a specific vessel or look at various planets. And of course, the one that we're going to be using first, the vehicle assembly building. But before you start, the very first thing you need to do is you need to go to the mission control. And the reason I say that is if you're starting a brand new career, you really need to get these initial contracts so that you can get the money to do other things. Now, for example, this contract gives you an advance of 2,240 and a completion value of 4,160. Now that may not sound like a lot, but in early career 6,400 can really make a difference. And this is a simple gather scientific data from Kerbin. That's going to be simple enough, and we'll go over that when we get our vessel launch. So you can only accept 2 contracts to start with. So we're going to accept the gather scientific data, and we're going to accept the launch our first vessel contracts. While we could accept these contracts instead, there's no way we're going to escape the atmosphere or orbit Kerbin before we launch our first vessel. La-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di-da-di. And if you're in chat, feel free to ask questions. So, this is the vehicle assembly building, and the very first thing you've got to do is pick a command pod. These are our pods. It's the top of your little thing here. You've got pods, fuel tanks, engines, command and control, structural, coupling, payload, aerodynamics, ground, thermal, electrical, communication, science, and utility. We're going to start by covering the very basics. In this case, we're going to use a Mark I command pod, which is the only pod you get to start with. And we have no fuel tanks yet, so what we're going to have to do is use a rocket, which is a solid rocket booster, which means it is a fuel tank and engine all in one, and the solid rocket boosters cannot be turned off. Once you launch them, it's like a rocket for a model rocket. There's no throttle control, there's no any of that, it just goes. And so we take that and we put it underneath there. Now if we were just to go launch this, our Kerbal would die. Why? No parachute! Poor little Kerbal would die because it would go up and then come down with the exact same amount of force that it went up. That's not a good thing. So we're going to go add a parachute. Now the parachutes should be under utility, and we only have one parachute at the moment. So we will put that one parachute there. Now the next thing you're going to need to take a look at is over here is what we call staging. Now right now both the solid rocket booster and the parachute are on stage 0. This is a bad thing. This means the minute you activate the engine, your parachute also deploys. You don't want that. So what you're going to do is hit the little plus sign there to create a new stage and drag the engine down here. Now the parachute is the second stage and the engine is the first stage. Now this is important to note. The top stage on this list is going to be the last one. The one down here is the first. Even though the numbers count upwards, if I were to add additional stages, so now it would be this one, and then this one. So even though this says stage number 2, it actually is your first stage. The numbers are in fact backwards there. So we're going to just sit here with our parachute and a rocket. Now, you may notice that there's a little bitty gap here. See that? That little bitty gap? I wish they would fix that, but you can fix it by clicking on either the Move tool or hitting the number 2 key on your keyboard, clicking on the part that we want to move. You'll get these little green, red, blue arrows, and if you hold that, in fact just touch it, it will pop up into position, and now it looks wonderful. And then you can go back to the Place tool. Now right now, you've got a very powerful little rocket engine. Not powerful compared to other things we'll get later, but considering the size and mass of this command pod, if you right click on it, you'll see your thrust limiter and you'll see the amount of solid fuel that's on it. And you'll see this thing called rigid attach. We don't need to worry about that right now. Now, if we had Kerbal Engineer up, I could tell you exactly how much thrust to weight in delta V we would have out of this engine. Now, thrust to weight is the amount of force that's being exerted upwards, and in fact you can see the direction of the thrust by clicking on the little icon over here that says Center of Thrust Overlay, and that shows you the direction your rocket is thrusting, in this case down. Very nice, nicely centered, but it doesn't tell me how much force it has. Now we could calculate the force because the vessel mass is 2,440 kilograms, and the rocket here says that it has a thrust at sea level of 162.9909 kilonewtons. Now there is a very fancy mathematical equation that you can use that will calculate the thrust in kilonewtons versus the weight of the craft to determine the thrust to weight. A thrust to weight of 1 means you are exactly offsetting the weight of the vessel, which means you would, versus gravity, which means you would just hover there. Now as fuel burnt out, your craft would become lighter and slowly your thrust to weight would climb. In fact, that will happen no matter what we do here, is that even if we were to reduce the total thrust, and note that you can't see that in kilonewtons, so we could only say that if I set this to half, it would tell me that I would have instead of 162, I would have 81 kilonewtons of force at sea level to start with. But as we burn off fuel, the vessel gets lighter, and then we would have to recalculate our thrust weight on the fly. This is why Kerbal Engineer is so handy. So let's open up our Kerbal Engineer. And the first thing you're going to want to do is click on Settings and tell it that you want to be partless. Now I keep it by partless by default, but if you have it on career, you have to add a little part in order to see the data while you're in flight. So keep it on partless, and then don't worry about the settings. You want to make sure your body is set to Kerbin, which is where we're launching from. You want the atmospheric on, and you can usually leave it as compact, but we'll just leave it open like this so you can see what we're looking with. So it tells us that we've got 3 parts. It tells us the total cost of the vehicle. It tells us the mass of the vehicle with and without fuel. It tells us the ISP, which is the specific impulse. It tells us our thrust, our torque, and our thrust to weight. The thrust to weight number here is the amount that we have at launch, and thrust weight max has to do with how much thrust we would have at the end of the fuel tank. And then we have our delta V number, and then we have how long it would take for the rocket to burn. So if we reduce this, we want this number, this thrust to weight number, to be approximately 1.4 or 1.5. Now if we do that, we have to reduce this all the way down to about 21. 21 gives us a nice 1.43. Now note that the max is 2.15, and this has increased the burn time to 42.1 seconds. Note that the delta V did not change at all, but our thrust and our ISP didn't change at all, nor did our mass. We didn't change any of the fuel values, we just lowered the thrust values. Yeah, kilonewtons, not fig newtons, as one of my people in chat has said. Thank you, Fluffy Bunny. So we want to keep, we don't actually have to worry about G-forces in the normal build. You can actually make it in the custom settings that they actually, Kerbals will pass out at certain G-forces, but by default in a normal career it is not enabled. And that's me having a little sip of tea here. So the delta V, a lot of people ask me, what does TWR and delta V mean? TWR stands for thrust to weight ratio. That's basically how much thrust you have versus how much mass the vehicle has versus the gravity, right? Gravity is actually a part of this equation. So at sea level, your gravity is on Earth 9.92 meters per second squared, 9.81 meters per second squared, I believe. So if you were giving out the exact same amount of thrust as 9.81 meters per second squared, you would sit there. You would basically be weightless. As the minute you go above that, you would start rising. If you have a below that, you never get off the ground. So that's why we want this to be a number above 1. Your delta V is how much you can move related to another object. So for example, if I'm traveling in space, and there's another vessel or object that's traveling at 100 meters per second relative to me, I can either, if I have 100 delta V, I could either be moving up to 200 meters versus it if I fire in the direction that moves me away from it, or I could be offsetting its speed and take it down to 0. So it is not a number based on my speed. It is a number based on my relative speed, and it has to do with my change in velocity. Delta change, V velocity. So it's how much I can change my velocity relative to other objects. Now, it's a little bit trickier than that, but that's sort of the best way to think about it. And I'm being told it's 9.80665 meters per second squared. So thank you, chat, for getting me the exact number. So right now, we have set it so that our thrust is at 21 on our thrust limiter, which means that we've got 34.211 kilonewtons of thrust, which gives us a thrust-to-weight ratio of 1.43. And as the fuel runs out, as the fuel gets eaten up, the max thrust-to-weight right before the rocket runs out of fuel, i.e. it has none of the mass of its fuel, will be 2.51. Our delta V is 773, and I know from experience that it takes well over that to get out of the atmosphere. So this is going to get us up into the sky, but it's not going to get us out of the atmosphere. So we can hit compact, and now if you hit compact on Kerbal Engineer, it will show you just the thrust weight and the delta V, which is very handy, and those are the numbers you want to pay the most attention to, which is why that's the default for compact. Now, this is not going to be terribly stable. The rocket pod itself, if you right click on the rocket pod, you will see that it has something here called reaction wheel, and it has pitch, yaw, and roll torque values. Now what those are is it's how much kilonewtons of force the command capsule can exert to alter its position. So for example, if the rocket starts tilting over and we have some aerodynamic forces acting on it to try to push it the other direction, if it's more than 5 kilonewtons of force in torque, we won't be able to hold it and will start tumbling uncontrollably. So what we can do is we can go down here to aerodynamics and we can add a simple basic fin to try to stabilize our rocket. Now, you're going to want to hit X to increase the number of these fins you've got, and I usually like to do it in ×4, but you could do it in ×3 if you want. So let's take a look here, just for fun, and because chat suggested it, we're going to show you what happens if we set our thrust limit to 100% so that there was absolutely no reduction in thrust. We just say here, we're going to do this. We're not going to actually pay attention to any of this. We're going to make every mistake that most newbies make, right? We're going to do everything. Assume there's no Kerbal Engineer. Most of the time when you're first starting the game, you forget your parachute. So what I've done here is we've got a command capsule and a rocket, and we think we're ready to go, right? There's no parachute, there's no nothing. We didn't think about parachutes. We didn't adjust the thrust limit at all, and we just go up here and we click launch. This is just for demonstration purposes. So you start off on the rocket pad here, and I'm going to close this so that you don't see it. And actually, let's hide that, because normally you would not see any of that. You would see just these buttons here. This button would not be here. You would have no other buttons. This would be how your display looks. Down here you've got your one stage. You can see which stage it is by mousing over it, and as you can see, it's our rocket. And down here you've got your surface speed. You've got your throttle control, which is irrelevant because we've got an SRB that we can't throttle up or down. Up here you've got your communication to the Space Center, whether or not you can transmit data science, your signal strength, and whether or not you've got crew control. This value tells you how long it's been since you lifted off. This tells you our actual height over sea level. We start at 69 meters above sea level because we don't start in the water. This shows you your atmospheric pressure here. Right now we are at the bottom would be at sea level. We're just above sea level. As you can tell, we're at 69 meters above sea level. And this has to do with your velocity. Right now we're at 0 velocity as it goes up or down. Going down is how fast we're coming back down. This is a light. This is an action group, our gear action group, which we don't have any gear on it. And this is our brakes, which again, we don't have any brakes. If we had set something up, we can set up an abort action group, which we'll talk about later, maybe even in another video. But that right now does nothing. So the first thing that we want to do is just launch it, right? We don't say we just got the game, we put these two pieces together, and we just hit launch. Let's see what happens. Up we're going. As you can see, our g-forces, this is our g-force scale, 15 all the way down to 0. We're traveling here at about 1,000, up at about, what, 800? Actually, here it says 500, so it gives you a better view. And we're going to make it all the way up to what, about 10K, maybe? A little over, maybe 11? Look at us go. You might think, yay, look, you can see the Kerbal Space Center down there. What a view. Over there is an island with an abandoned runway. You got some mountains in the distance. You're thinking to yourself, look at how high up I went. And right about now, you're going to be thinking to yourself, oh, how am I not going to crash when I land? This could be a problem, and in fact, it's a huge problem. A huge problem. All we've done so far is hit the space bar. And you see the rocket tips over because aerodynamics. When this part is empty of fuel, it's lighter than the command capsule, which means the heavier part moves downwards, which means that, hey look, the command pod is at the bottom. Plus we have the aerodynamic cone shape, and at this point it's become a lawn dart. Don't know if people know what a lawn dart is anymore. There used to be a game that was banned that was like lawn jarts, javelin dart things, but they were too deadly, so they got canceled as a kid's game. But when I was a kid, I remember them. So here we come down. You can see we're going faster and faster and faster and faster, and we're coming down. We're going to hit the ground at maximum velocity here. And we're basically coming straight up and straight down, and we're going to crash right into the ground here. And basically, this is the amount of distance that the world has moved underneath us as we went up and down. And boom, crash. Oh, tragic. Jeb, you had such a short life. In fact, at this point, you will get your flight results, and it will tell you that your highest altitude was 1,000 or 15,000 meters, your highest speed achieved was 660 meters, and so on and so forth. You can get highest G-force, 11.1, and it will tell you liftoff. Then we crashed into Kerbin 2.6 minutes later, 2 minutes, 6 seconds later, and you can either revert to launch, revert to vehicle assembly, or go to any of these other things. And in this case, we're going to revert to vehicle assembly because that means Jeb is alive and that launch never happened. So now let's do it right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put that silly parachute back on, right? That seems like a good thing. And then, as I said, you've got to worry about your staging. Now, later on, when you get, you're going to get things that allow you to separate parts off so you can have a multi-stage vehicle. When you do that, usually the staging isn't this messed up, so we're going to do it manually here, though. And as I said, we want to lower this to about 21. And note, I'm not looking at Kerbal Engineer right now. Now, you may be wondering about the things in the bottom left-hand corner. This. These are added by Kerbal Engineer, so I'm going to keep those closed. This, however, the engineer's report, is in fact not part of Kerbal Engineer. So it will tell you the number of parts, the mass of your vehicle, the height, weight, and length, and it will also show you if there's anything we need to worry about. In this case, it's saying our manned vessel does not have an antenna capable of transmitting scientific data. And if we look over here in communications, we go, well, that's too bad because we don't have any antenna yet. And over here it will say you have unused monopropellant. Now, by default, the command pod has 10 monopropellant. This is normally used to adjust your vehicle using little reaction control thrusters, and by default the command pod has 10 of these. Well, this is unused weight. Basically, it's mass that we're carrying with us that we cannot use, and by default it always has 10. So if you want to make sure that you get the best flight out of your vessel and you don't have anything that uses that, which normally would show up on command control, which is empty still because we haven't researched it, you can just empty it out by using the slide bar. At this point, it will say to us, we cannot transmit science, but everything else looks good. Now, I would say everything looks good except for the fact that we're going to come straight up and then come straight back down. And that's probably not what we want to do. And we're going to be a little unstable on our launch because if we try to turn to the east out over the ocean, which is what we probably want to do, the rocket will start tumbling due to torque from the atmosphere. So this is why I put basic fins on it. Now, one of the things you can do if you're worried about the stability of the rocket, and this is always a little bit fun, is if you hit the 3 key, which allows you to rotate, you can click on one of the fins, and you'll get a 3-axis rotate. If you go just a little bit off like that, you can see that now they're all set to make the thing spin. If you don't have good control, you can do what they call spin stabilization. This is actually what makes a bullet be stable. But in this case, we're not going to use that. I just wanted to show you that that's what rifling does to a bullet. It puts a small spin on it like that, and that stabilizes the bullet. Okay, so let's see how this goes. We're going to hit launch again. Hello, people in chat. So now we have two stages. You can see we have the, as we mouse over it, each of the stages lights up, see? And we have, again, the same looking screen. The one thing I'm going to do this time that's different than what I did last time is I'm going to hit the T key. When I hit the T key, you'll see Stability Assist light up, and you'll see the SAS, which stands for Stability Assist Systems, light up. This allows us to take advantage of that 5 kilonewtons of torque that I was talking about that the command pod has access to. By using that, and by reducing our thrust, now when I hit the spacebar, rather than just hitting the spacebar, I'm also going to slightly tap the D key. And by doing that, I can slowly tilt our vessel over to 90 degrees, and you don't want to go too far over. And by doing that, that allows me to control our vessel in ways that we could not if we did not have SAS engaged. This means that I will not come back down on top of the Space Center. So we're heading upwards at an angle. There are two good things about heading upwards at an angle. First of all, if you go straight up and straight back down, you may come back down too fast for your parachute to deploy in a way that you like. And second of all, you may come down over a space you don't want to come down over. Now, since we have two contracts, and there our rocket's just finished, we have two contracts: launch your first vessel and gather scientific data from Kerbin. So we're going to right-click on the pod while we're in the air, and we're going to click on what's called Crew Report, and then we'll get our science screen. And we're going to tell it to keep that experiment because we do not have a way to transmit the data right now. See, we cannot transmit science. Now, while we have communications with the KSC, we cannot transmit science. Now, as you can see, we're slowly tilting over, and we're going to start to accelerate here as we come down. Now, we don't want to, this is our parachute. If we go too fast, that parachute won't deploy. So we want to deploy the parachute now. And if we hit T, we turn off our SAS. Now, at some point, the parachute's drag is going to overcome the aerodynamic forces of the rocket from the weight of the command pod being heavier. And we can actually assist that a little bit if we wanted to wobble back and forth. But we'll just wait for the chute to deploy. To those in chat who say nice to see you playing KSP again, I play KSP every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Those are my KSP days. Every morning at 100 meters or 1,000 meters, the chute started to deploy. Then the drag became greater than the fact that this was heavier, and we flipped the capsule around, and now we're coming down at a nice 6.6, 6.5 meters per second. When you're coming down, you want to land below 8 meters per second, or you might damage your craft. So we're just going to keep gently wafting down, and we'll land in the water, which is nice and soft by comparison to land. And Jeb looks very happy over here, and we've collected our one science experiment, and we'll just splash down in the ocean here. Kerbal chutes are not a mod, they are stock. Now note, we had no Kerbal Engineer open during this flight, and I will show you some of the usefulness of Kerbal Engineer as we do additional flights or in flight. Now note, our fins, they got ripped off. When we had the impact, the side fins all vanished. Why? Because they were damaged by the impact with the water. So even though we landed at a leisurely 6 point something meters per second, that was still rough enough to rip the fins off the side of the vessel. So that tells you how fragile things can be. Now that we're just sitting here in the water, we go up here and we click on Recover Vessel. And that will bring our vessel back. Now, anytime you are landed anywhere on Kerbin, you can click Recover Vessel. So even if your vessel lands on the opposite side of the planet somewhere, as long as it's stable, landed, and not moving, you can go to the top there and recover the vessel, and it will come back to the Kerbal Space Center like we've just done. So we get our crew summary for the flight, and it says crew report while flying over Kerbin. We got 3.5 science from that. We also got a recovery of a vessel that survived a flight, and we get 5 science for that. We also recovered the command pod, the rocket booster, and the parachute, and there were no solid fuel or propellant left, So we got 573 funds from the command pod, 113 funds for the solid booster, and 411 for the rocket itself, which means that we recovered 1,098 funds from the recovered parts. Now, the closer you are to the KSC when you hit recover, the more value you get. So right up here you say 3 parts and 2 resources recovered at 10.8 kilometers from the Kerbal Space Center for a total of 97.5% value. If we were recovering from the other side of the planet, that percentage would be significantly lower. So the closer you can land to the KSC, the more value you get back. Now, in most games, the percentage difference there for your recovery isn't going to make or break you, but it is something to be aware of. And then when we click on crew, we can say one crew member recovered. Jebediah Kerman is ready for his next assignment, and he gained 1 experience point, and we got no reputation gain. Now we have completed. If you come down over here, you will see this is where it tells you about contracts you've completed as well as world milestones. So by clicking on this, we can see we gathered scientific data from Kerbin, and then you can delete that once you read that. We have achieved our goal of gathering scientific data. Here are our world first milestones. We launched our first vessel. We broke the speed record of 25 meters per second. We broke an altitude record of 500 meters. It just goes down through this list of everything that we managed to accomplish, splashing down the ocean. Each one of these you get as a world first milestone, and it either gives you money, science, or reputation, or a mix of those. Here's our launch our first vessel contract. So now it says 0 over here, and we've completed all of that. And you can see that's been completed, so our goals there are all set. So now we've got a whole bunch more contracts, don't we? Look at all that. We've got focused observational survey of different parts of Kerbin, testing an engine, testing a decoupler, escaping the atmosphere, testing a parachute, testing the Hammer solid rocket booster, and orbiting Kerbin. But right now we're not going to pick up any of those. We've got up here, you can see we've got 141,587, I call them Kerbal bucks, but it's basically the money unit. This is your reputation meter. We're in the green here. You don't want to be in the yellow. And if you look really closely, you can see some number values there. But anyway, and then this is how much science we have, 21.5. So let's go spend some of our science. This is your science chart. You start off with the very basic research. This is where you get the solid rocket booster, the command pod, all that. These you all get for free. It goes all the way down here to things like the Rapier, which is an air-breathing, rocket-breathing, a rocket hybrid engine, to complex large ore holding tanks and complex remote guidance software things, and an RTG, which is a part that creates electricity through plutonium decay, but in this case it's plutonium decay because we're KSP. But let's go back here. So each of these nodes is part of our tech tree, and if you click on any of the nodes, it will show you the parts that will become available when you buy it, and it will tell you the cost. The little green number in the top right-hand corner, or left-hand corner, is how many parts will be unlocked by buying that node. So for this, when you mouse over it, it will tell you the cost, and you can't buy, for example, general construction without having bought the things before general construction. So in this case, we're going to spend 5 science to buy basic rocketry by clicking research here. And then we're going to buy Engineering 101, which also costs 5 science, which gets us some antennas and a thermometer and a decoupler, which we'll go over here in a little bit. Now you can see we have additional things that we could buy here. We could buy survivability, stability, or general rocketry, but this costs 15, 18, and 20, and we only have 11.5 science. I'm being asked if there is a stock KSP, is there a way to figure out the fuel requirements needed to get to the moon, Duna, etc.? And the answer is yes, but it's really complicated. So let's go back out here and let's talk about delta V, because delta V is what you need to know about in order to calculate that. And oh boy, is that a lot of complicated things. So let's talk first about Kerbal Engineer and what it does for you, and how you could calculate these numbers yourself. So thrust to weight ratio is a calculation which, you'll love this, the thrust to weight ratio is the thrust over the weight times gravity. So what we would need is we would need to know the thrust, in this case at full, 162.91 kilonewtons. We would need to know the weight of the craft. In this case, we'd really need that number in kilograms, but it gives us 18 tons. Or no, 2.44 tons. And we would need to know gravity on the surface of Kerbin. Now let's see, I don't remember what gravity is on Kerbin. I think we can actually look that up. This down here is something that you need to learn and love. Right down here is a thing called the Kerbalpedia, and it will tell you all kinds of useful things about celestial bodies and all of that. So here it tells you about Kerbin and all of that, lovely things, space travel, orbital definitions, inclinations, orbital basics, getting up there. But these are all sort of the basic things. So let's go and go to our tracking station. Now right now our focus is on Kerbin, and if we mouse over here we can see information about Kerbin and the parameters. So at sea level, come on, you're not going to tell me the it tells me that escape velocity is 3,431 meters per second, and it says that at sea level we have 1 G. I wonder if it actually means that it's 9.8. Yeah, that's what I thought. Give me a second here. So the atmosphere of Kerbin is patterned after the Earth's U.S. standard atmosphere, but the scale is reduced by 20%, which means that the atmosphere for Kerbin is much shorter than for Earth. In fact, after 70 kilometers up, there is no atmosphere. And let's see, I'm trying to find the value of gravity on Kerbin. I know that there's some place where it is... yeah, here we go. So it's 9.81 meters per second squared. Perfect. So they actually used the 9.81. They rounded. So we could do the very complex math here of figuring out our vessel's weight, in this case 2,440 kilograms, or according to the engineering report, 2.44 tons. That's metric tons. So we could do the calculations. Now we know what the calculations are going to end up telling me. It's going to tell me that our thrust to weight is 6.80, which is a value of the thrust to weight, which is the thrust here, divided by the weight of the vessel times gravity. So you take this, you divide it by the weight of the vessel times gravity, and then that gives you kilonewtons over newtons, and then you convert it to newtons over newtons, and that gives you your thrust weight. So we could actually do the math if we felt like it. Should we do the math, guys? Or do you just trust me? Hopefully you just trust me. But if you want to look at the equations, there's a nice Wikipedia article on thrust-to-weight ratio, which shows you all the really complex math. Now, as for delta V, this is an even more complex figure to calculate. This is why I feel very strongly that a program like Kerbal Engineer needs to be stock, because we could do some very complex calculations dealing with the ISP and the thrust and the weight and the atmospheric pressure and figure out all of the delta V requirements and combinations. But it's so much easier just to look at this. Now, there are a couple of mods that give you this data. MechJeb will give you this data, Kerbal Engineer will give you this data, and I don't know if it's still out there, but Void used to give you this data, and there are a couple of other mods. I prefer Kerbal Engineer, but you can use whatever you prefer. Now, to reach an orbit of Kerbin requires roughly 3,400 delta V, roughly. In fact, that number changes every time they update the atmospheric model. I usually don't feel comfortable unless I've got about 4,000 delta V. But let's close this. Let's do a new vessel, because we've unlocked some new parts. We'll start with the command pod like we did before. We'll put the parachute on like we did before. But now we have some new parts. Under coupling, we now have a stacked coupler. And if we put that there, we can come down with just our pod. That's handy. And if we look at our engines, we now have the Flea, but we now have the Hammer solid rocket booster and the Swivel liquid fuel engine. We also have a very tiny T100 fuel tank. So, the first thing you need to know is right now our focus needs to be on science. Our focus does not need to be on getting to orbit immediately. It needs to be on gathering science so that we can unlock the early nodes of the tech tree so that we can do more. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the stack decoupler here, and I'm going to go down here to science. And under science, I'm going to grab 2 of these guys and put them on the side of the command pod. And I'm going to use after I attach them, I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm going to just clip them in a little bit. Now, normally, they would go tunk, 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 tunk like that. But if I hit the C key, I can do what's called fine adjustments. So we can reduce that so that we can have fine control over the parts. You're going to have to get familiar with the keyboard shortcuts if you really want to be able to do things in a more efficient way. 1 is to place a part, 2 is to move a part, 3 is to rotate a part, and 4 is to reroute the vessel. Don't worry about rerouting for now, but the rotate, the move, and the place are important. The other thing that's important is that X rotates the number of them that you've got on the vessel. See how we're changing our symmetry? And C changes whether it's set to a specific snap to or whether you've just got smooth rotation around the craft. Now we're going to put 2 of what we call the mystery goo containment units on it, and we're going to put a single thermometer on it. Now make sure it's down to a single. We're just going to snap that right there. And we're also going to take a look at communications. Now we've got 2 antennae. We've got the Communitron 16S and the Communitron 16. Now in stock, there is no reason not to use the Communitron 16, but if you were playing at any difficulty other than normal, the Communitron S allows you to transmit data without extending the antenna. Now, the reason this is important is it allows you to transmit data while traveling through the atmosphere. So we're going to take this, we're going to rotate it by using the E key, and we're just going to place it on the back of the vessel like that. Now, considering where that is, and the fact that I need to be able to click on the antenna, we're going to move this around and put the thermometer there so we can see it more easily. And we're going to put the antenna right there. Now, there are mods out there that make it easier to collect data. There are mods out there that add science parts. We're playing without any of those mods. So right now what we have is we have a command capsule, and we want to remove the monoprop like we did before. We have an antenna. We have 2 of what are called mystery goo containment units. We have 1 thermometer, and we have a decoupler. Now what that's going to do is, you can down here see stage number 1 has this little bar mark. That's the decoupler. When we stage that, this part is going to go like that, and this is all that's going to be left. Now, for most easy re-entries, when you're not like coming in from a really high fast speed, this is not going to need a heat shield, which is good because we haven't unlocked those or talked about them yet. We're just going to put that there. Now, we could do a couple of stages, but it's important to keep an eye on these numbers right here under the engineering report. Right now, we're using 7 out of a maximum number of 30 parts, and our mass is 1 ton out of 18 tons. The mass limit is based on how much you've upgraded your launch pad, and the part limit is based on how much we've upgraded our vehicle assembly building. I have not covered that, but if you were out on the main screen and you right-click on the facilities, one of your options is to upgrade them. Each upgrade does something different, and it will tell you what the upgrade does when you mouse over it. But for now, it's important to note that in the beginning of your career, you've got a maximum of 30 parts and 18 tons to play with. Right now, we are at 1 ton and 7 parts, and we haven't even put a rocket on it. And those are usually the most heavy parts. So let's just take a look here. For example, this fuel tank right here weighs half a ton. So if we put a couple of these here, and another neat trick is if you hold down the Alt key and you click, I can make copies of a part and any part beyond that part in the vessel. Now it's important to note that the vessel, it's treated like a tree. All the parts are spawning out from the root part, which in this case is the command pod. Now it's important to note that because it means you can't make a loop, because it can never connect back in on itself. You can make it look like it's connecting back in on itself, but the game will not interpret it as a loop back in on itself. So right now we have 2 fuel tanks. Each one of these fuel tanks is holding 45 liquid fuel and 55 oxidizer, and we've already added it so that we're at 9 parts and 2.195 tons. Let's add a couple more of those, and then we need an engine that can use that fuel. Now these are solid rocket boosters, they can't use that fuel, but this guy can. He's our LVT-45 swivel liquid fuel engine. So let's put him down here. Now, as you can see, it automatically staged it the way we wanted to. This time I didn't have to drag the engine away from the parachute because the game automatically knows about the decoupler. It knows this is the root part, and so it automatically said, okay, you've attached the engine on the other side of a decoupler. We're going to assume then that you want the engine to be before the decoupler in the staging. Sorry, just reading chat really quickly. So right now, this looks pretty good, right? We've got 4 fuel tanks, a swivel fuel engine, and some science on it. So let's see what Kerbal Engineer tells me. Kerbal Engineer tells me that we have a thrust to weight of 3.5, and we have a delta V of 1,314. Not horrible, but you might say, what about that thrust to weight? That's really high. You told me it wanted to be 1.4. That's true, but unlike the solid rocket boosters, this engine can actually be throttle controlled. So as we're flying through the air, we can actually reduce the amount of thrust. Rather than using the thrust limit here, we can actually use the control and shift keys on the left side of our keyboard to increase and decrease the throttle as we're traveling. The other thing is that we want to go really high this time. So let's see if we can add another stack decoupler. down here, and you'll see a shroud is formed around that part. And then let's go see if we could add one of these new Hammer solid rocket fuel boosters. Right there. Now you can see that this stage, as you can see, it's staged it all beautifully for us. We've got the solid rocket fuel booster, a decoupler, the engine, the liquid fuel engine, another decoupler up here, and then the parachute. Now, this tells us that stage 4, see it says S4, that's the solid rocket booster. That tells us that our thrust weight for the solid rocket booster is 2.39, and the total delta V for that stage is 676, and it will burn for 23 seconds. And then this says stage 2 is going to have 3.55 thrust to weight and a total delta V of 1,314. And then over here, you see the delta V if you add these two numbers together. So the first number is for that stage, and the second number is for that stage plus all the previous stages. So at this point, this one has just short of 2,000 delta V. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If you click the atmospheric button, it does all the calculations as if it was in a vacuum. So as you can see, in a vacuum, we would have 2,458 delta V, and our thrust to weight numbers also go up. This is because every engine has a value for ISP, which is how efficient it is, in the atmosphere, which is ASL stands for at sea level, and VAC stands for vacuum. And it also has a different thrust value at sea level and in a vacuum. So as you're traveling through the atmosphere is going to get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and you're going to get closer and closer and closer to that value of having absolutely no atmosphere to resist on the engine. So let's take a look here. So right now, since we cannot control the torque of the hammer, or I mean the thrust of the hammer, and it's at 2.3, we're going to reduce that thrust all the way down to 1.4. And, oh, we can't get quite to 1.4, but 1.41 is pretty good, and that's at 59 there. And we're going to hit compact. Now you can see that we're going to start off with a 1.41, and it's going to be 2.12 when it finishes its fuel, and that's going to give us 676 meters per second of delta V. And then the second stage is going to start, if we were at full thrust, at 3.5 and max out at 6.7 as all of these fuel tanks drain, giving us a total of 1,314 delta V, or just short of 2,000 when you add these two stages together. But that's not entirely accurate, because after this thing has lifted us up somewhat into the atmosphere, we're not going to be in a vacuum, which is what it shows us if I hit that button and it's now gray. But it's going, so that would give us 2,500 delta V, but we're not going to be in a vacuum. We're going to be somewhere in between. So we're probably going to have about a total of 2,200 delta V when we're done. So this looks pretty good, except for the fact that this part is all very heavy, and as the fuel runs out of this part, we're going to get very top heavy. We'd flip over and spin out of control, and it would be horrible. So what we need to do is we need to go down to aerodynamics, grab the basic fins, and we're going to try to put 4 fins on it. So now we have 18 parts running at 8.473 tons, and we've got 1.4 delta V, or thrust to weight, for the first stage because we've added weight. Adding 4 of the basic fins reduced the thrust to weight from 1.41 to 1.40. So just the fins, which are really, really light, they weigh basically 10 kilograms apiece. They are adding enough weight to make a noticeable change in that number. Now, one of the things you can look at, well, we'll worry about that later. I was going to show you how you could take a look at the center of mass. If we take the top part and we rotate it, it rotates everything else that's part of it. And if you take a look at the center of thrust versus the center of mass, you can see that the center of thrust is going to fire this way, but if we're firing up this way, the center of gravity is going, center of mass is here, and so the vessel is going to start to tilt this way. And without the wings on it, we just tumble uncontrollably. So that's why we put the fins on it. Hopefully the fins will be enough. I've had situations where even with the fins it tumbles uncontrollably. Now once we get rid of the hammer solid rocket booster and start using this stage, you might say, well, you don't have fins on this upper stage. This is correct. But unlike the solid rocket booster, the engine here, the swivel engine, is called a swivel because it's got what's called gimbal. This means that we can literally change the direction of the thrust by up to 3 degrees. This allows us to control the direction that the rocket is flying by changing the way that the engine is pointed, giving us more control even though we don't have fins. Okay, so this looks pretty good. It may not be ideal, but let's give it a try. So right now we have our rocket sitting on the launch pad. Now one of the things you need to know is that you can actually get data from the launch pad. So we could do a crew report. Now your first inclination might be to transmit that science data, and you can do that. And let me show what happens if you do that. You do that, it starts uploading. Remember, we added an antenna. That's the whole reason we're able to do that. But if you come over here, under your resources, you'll see that we had 50 electric charge. We only now have 14 electric charge. If you have no electric charge, not only can you not transmit more data, but using the SAS or the reaction wheels in the command pod requires electric charge. Now, you might be concerned and say, well, add more batteries. We haven't unlocked batteries yet. The other thing that we don't have to worry about right now is while this doesn't create any electrical current, while this engine, the swivel, is actually going, it actually creates electrical charge to help refuel our ship. So what we can do is we can hit T for our SAS, and we can just hit our space bar, and up we go. Now we're just going straight up for the first stage. I don't want to use any of my, we see that now we're at 13.97, 13.96. So we're slowly using some of our charge here, right? And while we're going up, we can right click on the thermometer and keep that data. Note that you get less value if you transmit it than if you keep it. And the same goes for the goo containers. And we're just going to keep that. Note that that said 7 and had some. We're already tilting over, by the way. That's not me. So now we hit the space bar to separate that part, and we hit the space bar again, and now we've got this. Now note, our electricity is going up, and we're starting to fall over, and I have to counter correct that. But the gimbal on the craft is able to correct some of that, see? I'm using the A key to prevent us from falling over anymore, and we're not really stable because we don't have that much in the way of fins.
Him?
But we're now at
He's a
full
panda.
charge,
You're a panda.
and we can do another crew report. And we could try to transmit that crew report. Oh, we're flying over the water. We've already done that one. But we haven't done a mystery goo while flying over the water, so we right-click on that. And it might be hard at first, but see now look, we're getting 7 science. You actually have to do this experiment multiple times to get its full value. We're just going to keep that experiment. Now you see we're traveling really, really fast. And the reason we're starting to burn up like that is because I started us at full throttle, or actually not even at full throttle. We're at partial throttle, but because I don't have anything that's showing me my thrust to weight, I don't know how fast I'm going thrust to weight wise. This is why Kerbal Engineer is handy when we're flying, and I'll show you that the next launch. Right now, we're out of liquid fuel, we're out of monopropellant, we're out of oxidizer, we have electric charge, but it's slowly going down. Now we're going to separate our last stage, which is going to get rid of all of this. And the reason we're going to get rid of all of this is because that means that our parachute doesn't have to carry all of that down. Now, if we had additional parachutes, we could carry all of that down and get the money for it. But in this case, it's easier for us to just get rid of that and slowly work our way back down. Now, right now the parachute is orange, and the reason the parachute is orange is because it is risky to deploy it right now. And the reason it's risky to deploy it is we're traveling at about 1,000 meters per second, and we're about to hit vacuum. Vacuum starts at 70 kilometers. Think we're going to break it? Think we're going to make it? We may make it. And we did it. Hear the music? That's your audio cue right there. Don't know if you can hear it, but there's faint music. The music kicks in when you break atmosphere. You don't get music when you're in the atmosphere. As soon as you break that 70-kilometer mark, you're in the out of the atmosphere and you'll hear music. Now, there's deploy mode when safe, and you can actually change that to deploy when risky or deploy immediately. Keep it as when safe, and then we can actually, we don't want to deploy at this moment because we're in a vacuum, deploying your chute while you're in a vacuum. But they added that because a lot of people were deploying the chute when they shouldn't deploy it. So let's do a crew report. Oh look, we're in space. So let's keep that so we can get full value of it and we don't use our electrical charge to transmit it. And we've already done the other science, so we're just waiting for ourselves to come back down. Now, there is a thing up here. You see the little times 5, times 10, times 50, times 100, times 1,000, times 10,000, and so on and so forth. That's your warp, your time acceleration. Now, if you're using a PC, you can use the 2 keys to the right of the M key, the period and the comma, to change your time warp value. Now, if you're in the atmosphere, as we are now, you can see that that's now changed to times 2 times 3 times 4. That's what we call physics warp. So there's 2 different kinds of warp. There's time warp and then there's physics time warp. Physics time warp still has the vessel being affected by physics, but you still accelerate, you're just maximum times 4. As soon as you hit an atmosphere, you're going to be pulled out of normal time warp and into normal speed. But if you come in too fast, you can literally be like halfway through the atmosphere and burn up before that happens. Now, what we want to do is, you see these little things here? This is retrograde to orbit, the one that looks like the yellow circle with the 3 things and the X in the middle. And we actually want to be retrograde to surface. See, if I click on this, it goes from surface to orbit. If we had a target, it would go through surface, orbit, and target, and we'll talk about that another time. But we want to be retrograde to surface so that our flat end is pointing down to slow us down. And as you can see, we're finally starting to slow down. We're going up, but now we're actually going down. And as soon as this stops being bright red, the chute can deploy. But because we set it to deploy mode for when safe, we can actually hit the space bar now, and it will automatically deploy as soon as it's safe to deploy. And when our pilot gets better trained, we'll have more options here, and we can talk about that. See, look, as soon as it was safe to deploy, the parachute deployed, and we're slowing down even more. Once the parachute is deployed, unless your craft is really unbalanced, I usually hit T to turn off the stability assist control and just let the parachute and gravity do its thing as we come down. Thank you, PlexiStan, for the host, and thank you all, everyone else, for the hosts. Sorry about that. I've been trying to do this tutorial, and I've been a little bit distracted here, but I am paying attention to chat. A lot of people are talking about how they just strap enough parachutes onto it not to worry. You can see here we've got the world first. We broke speed records, we broke altitude records, we reached space, we broke land distance records. Each of those is giving us a little money in science. Now, last time we had an SRB at the bottom that added to our total weight. And now we want to see just how slowly we're going to come down. Because we've added science, but oh, look, see, we're going to be coming down slower, and that's why you put the decoupler there, because we're not hauling down the SRB with us anymore, which means we're going to land more softly. And as I said, anything below 8 meters is pretty good, but the slower you land, the better. However, right now you're going to see our big thing right now is we could get bored. We're coming down at 5 meters per second, and we're roughly 350 meters up. Well, it doesn't take a genius to do the math. You just divide 350 by 5, and you see that's going to take 70 seconds. That's going to be over a minute for our craft to come down. Now, I'm talking, so that's going to make up some of that time. But if you are stuck at something like 2 point something meters per second downwards fall and you're 500 meters up, you're going to say, oh boy, that's boring. So you can use physics warp by hitting the period, and you come down faster. But do me a favor and always remember to keep an eye on your distance above the ground and get rid of physics warp before you hit the ground, because sometimes, and I haven't seen this so much in 1.22, but I've seen it in the past, when you hit, if you were on physics warp, it would act as if you were hitting harder. So here we are. Our little capsule is splashed down. It's like a little Mercury capsule, and we can just go back up here, and as I said before, you can recover your vessel from anywhere on Kerbin. So here's our mission summary craft, and you can see we did a crew report in space while near Kerbin for 5 science. We did a mystery goo observation while flying on Kerbin for 7 science. We also did another one while flying at Kerbin for 1.6. Remember how I said that it was giving us that 7, but it wasn't filling that bar up completely? The second one we did was also while flying, and it gave us another partial value. And you can see that the data value here, we got 1.0 for that. That means we got full value. By doing 2 separate mystery goo, we've gotten 7 and 1.6, which gives us 8.6 out of the 10 maximum. And you can see that because it says that we've gotten 0.7 and 0.16. If it was a full value of 1, it's going to be 10. Now we have to do that experiment something like 3 or 4 times to get the full value of it. So that can be a little bit frustrating, but it gives you a reason to take an experiment multiple times. Here's our temperature scan while we were flying. Here we only took 1 value, and again it was 0.7, and that got us 5.6 science. And here we have the recovery of the flight vessel after a suborbital flight, and that gives us 8 science. So total science gained on this trip, 27.2. Total science, 47. Now you might say, wait a minute, you didn't have 20 science when you lifted off. And that's true, we didn't. The reason that we got the additional science that's not being calculated here is, remember all those world firsts I showed you? Each one of those gave us about 1 science point. So that is not part of this calculation. And I've already gotten rid of it so you can't see it here. But when you add this value to the world gained, that would give us our new value of science when added to the science we had when we took off. Parts. Here you go. You can see that we landed 245 kilometers away from the Kerbal Space Center, and this time we only got 86.5% of the value. But again, we got about 3,300 value back from our parts recovered. And finally, crew. No new gain for Jebediah. He's already done 2 flights, and this time he didn't get any extra XP just for going suborbital. And so now we have 47.2 science, we have 200,976 cash, and a little bit more reputation. Now this, I really wish that this was a value that you could actually right-click on and see the actual total value for. Now you can come here over to the administrative building, and these are where we get various campaigns. I'm not going to cover those today, but those take reputation to set up and things like that. We're not going to worry about that, but just know that when you're out of the basics of the game and you want to start worrying about more complex things, you can use these to change reputation into other things or other things into reputation. For example, you could do outsourced R&D, which takes 5% of your income and gives you additional science for each amount of funds, and you can actually change the commitment value to these, which changes the amount of reputation you need to set it up, and all that. Very complicated, and we won't worry about that right now. Now, remember how I said you can right-click on these parts and upgrade them? So the launchpad itself here tells you that when you right-click on it, it says that the max vessel size is 20 meters, and the max weight is 18.0 tons. But we could upgrade it for 50 of our Kerbal bucks. If I mouse over it, you can see those values change. You can now do a 36 by 39.6 meter vessel and have 140 tons. Note that's a huge increase. You go from 18 tons to 140 tons, and we've got 201,000, so spending 50,000 to increase that is not a bad idea. So we're going to do that. We're going to spend that 50 right there, and as you can see, the graphic for it changed, and when we launch, you'll see we're no longer launching off of just a simple concrete pad. Now, the other part that you might want to upgrade is the vehicle assembly building, because normally the max parts supported is 30, but as you can see, that would have cost us 225,000, which we didn't have. But if we bought that, it would change the number of parts that we could use from 30 to 255. Plus, we could start using what are called basic action groups. These are things I'll cover next time we do further tutorials. Now, every one of these buildings has upgrades. For example, we could upgrade the tracking station, and if we did that, we could now see patched conics in the map, and it would increase the maximum deep space network power to 50.0 G, which has to do with how many meters the antennas on the tracking station and deep space network can communicate. This is important when you're trying to transmit science and that kind of thing, if you're using the basic system and the basic built-in communications that are designed into the stock game. In order to do what we call maneuver creation, which is another thing we're not going to be really covering today, you need to both have the tracking station and mission control upgraded. This, as you can see, it says tracking station upgraded required for flight planning. Flight planning is what is the maneuver node creation. So if we upgraded this, we could go from 2 maximum contracts to 7 maximum contracts at a time. And if we'd upgraded the tracking station, we could now create maneuver flights, maneuver nodes, which again we'll cover next time. Down here in the astronaut complex, we can currently have 5 active Kerbals, but if we upgraded it, we could have Kerbals perform EVAs, which means they could go outside of the spacecraft when they're in space, and they could plant flags while they're out on a moon or something like that. Again, not something we need to worry about right now. But the one that you will have to worry about, probably third or fourth, is research and development. Right now, we can research anything up to 100 science value, and as you see, we only have 47.2 at the moment, so that's not a huge issue. But you're going to find that you're going to have to upgrade it to get to the more complex science bits. The first upgrade will allow you to get 500 cost science things, but also is required for off-world EVA surface samples and resource transfers. When you want to like dock 2 ships together and transfer fuel over, you have to have this upgraded in order to do that. Now, you can also upgrade the runway, like we upgraded the landing pad. It's the exact same thing except for the runway, but it changes the runway from gravel to paved, which is a huge increase in the ability to use it. To be perfectly honest, right now, if you try to launch from the runway, you're better off going off of the runway onto the grass and then launching from the grass, because the grass is smoother than the runway is by a large margin. But it also affects the weight of the vessel. And just like this vehicle assembly building, if you right-click on the spaceplane hangar, normally 30 parts, the first upgrade, 255 parts. Now, if you've upgraded the spaceplane hangar and have not upgraded the vehicle assembly building, you could make a plane that has 255 parts, but you couldn't make a rocket that has 255 parts. Now, there's a trick to this, in that you can actually make a plane in the vehicle assembly building or a rocket in the spaceplane hangar if you get creative with it. So just because you've upgraded one and not the other, you can sometimes make the vessel that you need in the other one. But again, that's a little bit more complex than we want to deal with right now. So what we've upgraded right now is we've upgraded the launch pad, which now allows us, instead of 18 tons, we now have 140 tons that we can worry about before we run into our maximum weight, and our vessel size is increased. But because we couldn't afford to upgrade the vehicle assembly building, we're still limited to 30 parts. Now let's go look at our research and development. We're still limited to 100 science, but since we only have 47, we couldn't buy a 100 science node anyway. Now we have 3 nodes here, and you might notice this we started with. These both cost 5. This one costs 15, 18, and 20, but once you get past that, everything has a cost based on its tier. So everything here is going to cost 45. Everything here is going to cost 90. See that? And everything here costs 160 in this tier. And everything in this tier is going to cost 300. Everything in this tier is going to cost 550. And everything in this tier is going to cost 1,000. So once you're past this level, it's 45, 90, 300, 160, 300, 550, and 1,000. So you can see we can buy everything through this node without upgrading the Space Center. But if we want anything in the 160 range, we're going to have to upgrade the Space Center. And that's going to be important because there's certain heavy rockets and such that you can't get until you upgrade the Space Center. But for now, let's take a look at what we can buy. We've got 47 science, and we have 15, 18, and 20. So we could buy any two of these, but we're not going to have enough to buy all three. So all three would be 20, be 38, be 53. So we can buy any two of these, but we can't buy all four, or any two of them, but we can't buy all three. So for survivability, we get heat shields, a barometric pressure science experiment, a radiator, some micro landing struts, some additional parachutes, and a thing called a service bay. For the stability, we get an aerodynamic nose cone, a better winglet, and a radial decoupler. And for the general rocketry, we get a Reliant fuel engine, a solid solid rocket booster, which is much bigger than the previous two that we had, and a larger fuel tank that holds double the amount of fuel. Now, the reason the larger fuel tank is important is not because of anything about just having double the amount of fuel, but the reason it's important is because, remember, we're limited to 30 parts, right? The vehicle assembly building says we can only have 30 parts in our rocket. If we have to use the FLT100, we'd have to use 2 of them for every one of these parts, right? And since we're limited to 30 parts and 140 tons, because we upgraded the launch pad, having larger fuel tanks becomes very important. So let's take a look. What do we want? Well, personally, I like getting this first, the survivability, because it gets us another science experiment, and science experiments are what let us unlock additional things. Plus, it allows us to get drogue chutes, which I'll talk about in a minute, and radially attached normal chutes. So I'm going to pick up this for 15. Then I'm going to come up here to general rocketry, and because I like having larger fuel tanks so that we can get around that 30 maximum part issue, and I like having the solid rocket boosters, I'm going to pick up general rocketry for 20. Now we've got 12 left, and we need 6 more to get stability. So we leave the facility, and let's go to mission control. Now, we've already left the atmosphere, and I never picked up the contract for it, so I'm going to regret that a little bit. But take a look at our contracts. See how it says to test the LV-T45 swivel liquid fuel engine at the launch site. Test the TR-18 stack decoupler at the launch site. Anything that says at the launch site is a contract you should probably pick up, because I'll show you. This has a maximum value of 4,725 and 1 science and 1 reputation. So let's accept that contract. Let's also accept the swivel test. Again, test the part on the launch pad. And I'll show you why the launch pad tests are so much fun. So we go to the vehicle assembly building. We do a new ship. We'll grab a command pod. And then we look at our contracts. We need to test down here, when you're in the vehicle assembly building, the thing that's just to the right of the gear and the left of the little, I don't even know what that's supposed to be, but it looks like maybe kind of a notifier, is the contracts. And if you click on it, it'll stay. Like if you mouse over it, it's there, but if you click on it once, it actually stays. And it tells me my 2 contracts. So we need to test the swivel engine, and we need to test the decoupler on the launch site. Now, testing these things on the launch site does not require a lot of fancy footwork. So one of the things we can do is we can quite literally take this engine, we see the engine we need, which is this, and we can put it on top of the capsule. Look at that. Isn't that silly? And we can also take the decoupler under coupling and put it right there. Now you might say, well, that's never going to work, but watch this. So here we are on the launch pad, and we need to test these parts. So part 1 is the decoupler, and as it says, simply stage the decoupler. It says note that we've got green check marks here. We're on Kerbin and we're at the launch site. If you click on the note, it says simply activate the part through staging sequence when all the test conditions are met. Well, what do you know? All test conditions are met. So let's hit the space bar. Look, we completed a contract. Seems kind of silly, but we did. Now let's hit the space bar again. Look, we completed another contract. We've completed both of our contracts. Then all we have to do is recover our vessel. And look at this. We got 100% of our value back. We didn't use anything. We got 100% of our value back because we were at the launch pad when we recovered. Good news, everyone! Thank you for the follow, TomTom. We got 100% of our value back. We didn't use any fuel, so the cost of the craft was $2,200, but we got 100% of that value back, plus we got the value for both of the contracts we just completed, which helped us gain a significant amount of cash. No experience for Jeb, obviously. But there we go. So we got full value back, and we just completed those 2 contracts. So anytime you have one that requires you to be at the launch pad, it's a good place to just run the test and get the free value. Now there's another trick I'm going to show you here. One of our contracts here says test the LV909 Terrier liquid fuel engine splashdown on Kerbin. Now I'm going to accept this. The reason I'm going to accept this is because, watch this. We've accepted that contract. Good news, everyone! Thank you for the follow on us, John. We come here, we do a new vessel, we grab our Mark 1 command pod, and we go down here to engines. Look! See that light blue background or aqua background on that? We haven't unlocked that engine yet. That engine does not exist if we don't have this contract. That's from a tech node that's one more up down the line for our engines. But it's here. And why is it here? It's here because we have a contract. See how it says experimental next to it? It may say experimental, but it's the exact same part. Top to bottom, it's the exact same part that we would use if we had it open and available to us. This allows us to access parts before we've unlocked them on the tech tree. So we have access to the Terrier liquid fuel engine, even though we've not unlocked the tech for it, simply because we're supposed to be testing it as part of our experiments. So here what we're going to do is we're going to take this, we're going to put a fuel tank here, we're going to put a Terrier here, right? And all we have to do is splash down with that to test it. But I'm going to use this for another reason too. So let's leave this. We're not going to save our craft. We're going to go back to the mission control, and we're going to tell it we're going to try to orbit Kerbin. Now, the reason the Terrier is so important is because it is the first engine that you get. It may have very, very, very low thrust. See, at sea level it only has 14 kilonewtons of thrust. And in a vacuum it only has 60 kilonewtons of thrust. That's not a lot of thrust compared to what we've been seeing, right? Our swivel engine had 215 in a vacuum and 167 on the launch pad. But take a look at the engine ISP. Right here. See, it has 85 at sea level. So it's really an inefficient, weak engine at sea level. But look at that vacuum number, 345. That means that in a vacuum, it is a very efficient engine. By comparison, the Reliant has 310 in a vacuum, and the swivel engine has 320 in a vacuum. That little bit of difference makes a huge difference when you're trying to get into orbit, because you can push yourself out of the atmosphere with other engines and then use the Terrier to circularize your orbit in the vacuum so that you can actually get into a valid orbit. So the Terrier as an end stage for your vessel in orbit is an important thing to think about. The other important thing is that it's got a very high vectoring gimbal of 4 degrees. This allows you to maneuver your vessel around while the engine's firing in ways that you couldn't do except maybe with the swivel. It does have one drawback, and this is something important if you don't have batteries yet, which is while these engines put out an alternator electric charge, the Reliant puts out 7 per second while it's at full output power, and this one, the swivel, puts out 6 per second while full output power. The Terrier does not have an alternator, which means that it does not create electrical current. Now, if you're in a situation where you're going to start running low on electrical current, and we haven't unlocked any batteries yet, or solar panels, or anything fancy like that, then that alternator is an important part of getting you to where you need to be electricity-wise. More than once I've seen people get into orbit and use the Terrier and run out of electricity, and that's the end of the mission. So you've got to make sure that you either have enough electricity through a battery that you unlock later, or that you pay attention to your electrical current, knowing that this is not going to give you any more electrical current, and that this vessel, the command pod, can only hold 50, and know that you need to have enough electrical current to re-enter properly. If you run out of electrical current, if you're on a re-entry path, you can no longer use the reaction wheels in your command pod, and I believe you can still deploy your chute. There was a previous version where if you ran out of electrical current, you could no longer stage. You certainly can't transmit science anymore, and if it's a probe, you have even less control over it. You still have some control when there's a Kerbal inside, and you even, depending on what your settings are, you can have minor control over a probe when you have no communication, but if you run out of electrical current, the probe is dead. You have no control over the probe when it runs out of electricity, even if you can maintain communications with it normally, because the antenna no longer works. So let's see if we can get into orbit. So we're going to remove the monoprop like we've always done. We're going to put some parachutes on this puppy. So now we're going to put the Mark 16 parachute on like we have since the beginning, but we have 2 new little parachutes to play with. We have the Mark 12R radial mounted drogue chute, and we have the MK2R radial mounted parachute. Now, the reason you want to pay attention to the drogue chutes is that they can be deployed at a much higher speed and still be deployed safely. The standard chute can be deployed at 264 meters per second. The drogue chute can be deployed at 424 meters per second, which is a lot faster, and so you can deploy this chute to slow down the craft enough that you can then deploy the normal parachute. So what I normally do is I take 2 of these, and by hitting X I'm getting symmetry here. There should be one on the other side, there it is. And again, since we don't have a decoupler between this stage and this stage, I'm going to need to manually separate these, and I want to be able to deploy the drogue chutes before the normal chutes. So I've had to manually separate these out by clicking the plus to add additional stages down here in the bottom corner, and then dragging the sections I want. Now, one of the nice things is that if I drag the drogue chutes, they move together. Now, you can separate them, but by default they move together. So right now we have a nice little vessel, and as you can see, you're like, well, look at that, that's only 390 delta V, why would we care about that? If you click the atmosphere button, suddenly you see that when we hit a vacuum, it's going to be 1,584 delta V, and in a vacuum, instead of 0.5 thrust to weight, it's going to have 2.29 thrust to weight. That's a huge difference. That shows you just how much more powerful this engine is in a vacuum. That's why this engine is usually what you need in order to get into a good orbit. Usually I wait until that engine is available through the tech tree to get into orbit, but this time we got lucky, it's shown up here. Now, the Terrier, it says to perform the test, activate the part through the staging sequence when all test conditions are met. We're not going to do that. The reason we're not going to do that is because we're going to be activating the staging for it well before we ever splash back down. So, just so you know, that's not going to happen on this launch. So now we take this section, and let's add a coupler, the decoupler here, and let's put something more underneath it here. Now, instead of having 4 of the FLT 100 fuel tanks, I'm going to put 2 of the FLT 200 fuel tanks, and then I'm going to put the swivel engine in. Now, the difference between the Reliant engine and the swivel engine is not that big. The swivel engine has slightly less thrust. So this has a 205-240 kilonewton thrust. This one has a 167-215. But this one has a 250/320 ISP for its efficiency, and this one has a 265-310. Now you may notice that means that this one's much more efficient at sea level, but less efficient in a vacuum. But the other big difference between the two is the Reliant doesn't have that gimbal we were talking about. The gimbal is important when we're talking about a mid-stage to keep the rocket stable. So at this point, I want to have the swivel engine here instead of the Reliant because I haven't unlocked any fins that can actually turn. While these basic fins can keep us stable, they don't actually have the ability to swivel on any kind of point, so they can't actually adjust our flight. They just help keep us stable. Now remember, we can have more parts, but more weight, but we can't have more parts. So right now you can see that we're at 10 out of 30 parts, but our mass is 6 out of 140 tons because we upgraded that the launch pad. So if we take the stack decoupler here, now let's take a look at that brand new thumper we unlocked. This is our new large SRB. Now, as you can see, we're at 14 tons and 12 parts, and if we take a look at this without atmosphere, we're now at 3,598 meters per second of delta V. That's pretty good. In fact, we're pretty close to what we could probably do for orbit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put that back there, and I'm going to take this part off. I'm going to add another fuel tank and see what happens. $3,673 versus 3,500. So that only added about 100 delta V, right? But what if we took that and put it here? 4,373. Now 2,342 is probably going to get us high enough that we're going to get good thrust to weight and delta V from the top stage. That looks pretty good to me. Now we've got the bottom stage here. It's got 1.67 thrust to weight. Let's put our fins on the bottom here to keep us stabilized. Now let's take a look. We've got 17 parts, 15 tons, and we probably can get into orbit here. Now we want to adjust our staging. Always double check your staging. So you've got your SRB down here, and then you've got the separator between this section and this section, and then you've got that engine there, and then, oh, what? That engine's there. We don't want that engine to be there. So we need to adjust our staging. So what we want to do is we want to take that there, and now we'll double check. So we've got our solid rocket booster, our decoupler, our second engine, our decoupler between those two sections, our last engine, and then we've got our parachutes. Now let's take a look. That's pretty good. And lastly, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put a coupler between this and this so that when we re-enter, we're not taking down the whole engine with us, because this section is going to be light enough and less aerodynamic enough that we'd come in straight like a lawn dart if we tried to bring all of that back with us. So let's take a look. Make sure our staging is right again. Look, that decoupler tried to sneak up with that parachute, and we don't want that. We've got that engine, that decoupler, that engine, that decoupler, that engine, that decoupler, our drogue parachutes, which we deploy first, and our final chute there. Looking pretty good. Now let's see if we could throw a little science on this just for, you know, reasons. Because science is always good. So let's take the barometric pressure reader with us. Now remember, I'm not putting an antenna on this. Part of the reason I'm not putting an antenna on it is because if you take a look at our total electrical charge, it says no, electrical charge required but not generated. This vessel cannot generate electrical charge. While that's not entirely true, the swivel engine is going to generate some electrical charge, but it is right in the general meaning that we have no solar panels. Now we can't get solar panels yet, so it's not like we can do anything about it, but it is important to take a look at the engineering report. It also says that we don't have an antenna, and that's okay, because since we don't have any electricity, I don't want to be worrying about the antenna anyway. So now up here, we're going to click up here, and you can see how that highlights that. You can name it anything you want. And then you can save it, and now next time I could come back and load this craft in, and then make minor changes to it, and then save it as a different craft. So this is a nice little thing. I think we're going to reduce the thrust weight just slightly on the thumper, and I feel like we're pretty good here. Now I'm going to show you go to crew, and you can change who's in the pod. Now Jebediah has been on a couple of missions, but since it is Valentine's Day when I am recording this, we're going to be putting Valentina Herman in the cockpit. Only seems fair. So we've saved our vessel under that name, and now we can go to launch. And here we are. Now, remember, I said we upgraded this. Remember, we were on a concrete slab before. Now we're on a bit of a launch pad. Look at that. Pretty neat, huh? We're going to hit T to stabilize ourselves. And this time I'm going to pull up Kerbal Engineer. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to show you some stuff that we can see that we normally can't see except on our map screen. Now this is the map screen. I want to pay attention to our apoapsis and periapsis heights. The reason I want to pay attention to that is that tells me how close we are to breaking the atmosphere and how close we are to being in a stable orbit. If both the apoapsis and periapsis are above 70 kilometers, we're in orbit. If the apoapsis is above 70, our peak is above the atmosphere. These values can be seen from the map view, but you can't. While you can pull up your nav ball while you're here, you can't hit spacebar to stage your vessel from here. And so having this number value here, I think is very important, and is one of the reasons I really like to have this. In addition, note that it shows me my delta V, it shows me my current thrust to weight, my current thrust, all of these useful information. That's why I like Kerbal Engineer, and if we want to get into orbit efficiently, we need to have those data points available. So let's take a look. We've got all of our staging right, we've already checked that, we're ready to go. Let's hit our spacebar and see if we can actually make this thing go into orbit and come back. So we're going straight up to start with, and I'm just going to go straight up until the SRB is out of fuel. And you can see here's by right-clicking on it, you can see the fuel going down, you can see the thrust going up as it runs lower on fuel. You can see that the thrust is also going up because we're going up to the atmosphere. Actually, the thrust shouldn't change as a matter of weight. The thrust-to-weight ratio changes as a matter of weight, but the thrust changes as a matter of the atmosphere thickness. You can see our apoapsis is going to be 6 kilometers, 7 kilometers, 8 kilometers, 10, 11, 12. And SRB is done. I hit the space bar, I hit it again, I do full throttle, and we go a little bit over this way. And you can see our apoapsis height is continuing to climb. Very nice. If I tilted it over too far, the gimbal wouldn't be able to adjust for the torque pressures caused by the aerodynamics. We want to get as high up as we can with this stage. So we're going to get to just short of 65 kilometers with that stage. And we don't really want to fire the next stage until we're further up in the atmosphere. And the reason for that is that, remember, that last engine here is really, really good at vacuum. So the closer we are to a vacuum, the better off that engine's going to be. Now, I would have liked to have turned over a bit more there, but we really couldn't turn as much as I would like to because we haven't unlocked the more resilient, stable fins, the ones that actually turn like actual tail fins. They just basically stay stationary and stabilize you. So we're about to hit our apoapsis, give or take. So I'm going to hit our spacebar and try to push ourselves further up into orbit here. And let's see if we can get ourselves into orbit. We may fall just short of it. We'll have to see. Now, the time to our apoapsis is going up, and that's a good thing. And you can see our apoapsis is now above 70 kilometers. But see how low our periapsis is? It's negative 516. Also, see this little thing, that yellow thing is our prograde, and we want to go just slightly off of set of prograde there. But keep in mind, if we run out of delta V and we're in orbit, we could have some problems. Now, we're a minute to our apoapsis. The best time to raise your periapsis is when you are at your apoapsis. Now, note we can see the burn time here is 1 minute and 5 seconds for this engine still left. So we probably want to start doing a burn when we're about 20 seconds away from our highest point right now, just to get our best bang for our buck. And someone has asked about our electrical current. We're down to 48 out of 50. So remember the previous engine was actually giving electrical current, so we didn't start running out of electrical current until we ditched that last stage. So right about now, so I hit Z to go to full throttle. That's the other thing. While you can use shift and control to do fine adjustments, Z is full throttle. So poof, we went to full throttle. And without these numbers, I'd be doing it by guesstimate, or I'd have to be looking at this to see our values. So it's much better to have Kerbal Engineer available so that we can actually see this. And you can see our periapsis here is really going up fast. That's good. And orbit. We are now, our apoapsis and periapsis are both above 80 kilometers. That means we are now in a stable orbit. We could sit here forever, but eventually we'd run out of electrical current and our Kerbal would die. Actually, no, I take that back. That's mostly a joke. Unless you have a life support mod installed, your Kerbals can sit anywhere forever. It doesn't matter if they've run out of electrical current, as long as they're not re-entering or burning up or something like that, or designated to crash into a planet's surface, they can literally just stand there forever. So Val could just sit here in orbit forever, and we would be quite happy with that. Well, she wouldn't be happy with that, but there you go. We're in orbit. Now let's see if we can re-enter, but before we re-enter, I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to do a crew report. Look, we've already done a crew report up here, so we're not going to do that. The other thing is that somewhere here, there it is, our barometer. So let's take a barometer pressure test. And it says, while in space, the instrument reads 0. It's as if it were in a vacuum, and it is. So we're going to keep that experiment value. Now, in order to deorbit, as this was a prograde here, we want to fire retrograde, which means counter to the orbit, to decrease our periapsis and re-enter the atmosphere. Now note that every little bit of turning I'm doing here is eating electrical charge. That's the reaction wheels eating the electrical current as we adjust our angle, so you need to pay attention to that. So here we go. This is the retrograde symbol, and we're going to be firing opposite the direction we're re-entering, but I'm going to actually just sit here and wait until we actually go around once so that A, I land near the KSC, and B, I'm not doing our re-entry in the dark so that you can actually see what we're doing. Now, because I'm time warping here and because nothing's using any electrical current, we're not actually losing any. We're stuck at 44.79 electrical current because nothing's eating any of our electrical current. We're just going around Kerbin. As you can see, it's very dark, but you can look out there and see the Milky Way, although it's not really the Milky Way. The star box is not the Earth star box, meaning it's not actually created from NASA or real science. But it is pretty, and you can do various things with it. In fact, for a while I was doing a thing where I was asking people to design their own constellations from it, and we did one YouTube video about that. And someday I hope to do some more of that, but kind of trailed off there in interest. And here comes the sun. You can see the atmosphere of the planet. There's the sun. And now I'm going to reduce our time warp by hitting comma. Then we're going to flip over so that we're still pointing retrograde. And there we are. So now we're going to fire our rocket retrograde. Now we want to lower our periapsis not to 0, but we want to lower it to about 30 to 35. The reason we're doing that is that means that friction will take care of the rest of our descent, and we will spend more of our time in the lower atmosphere slowing down due to friction rather than coming in too hot, and sometimes that can make a big difference. Now, we can take a look at our map and see Kerbal Space Center is actually all the way over here. So if we come down here, we're going to land somewhere either in the desert or near the massive crater, but that's okay. I'm not actually trying to make sure we get our best value. So let's just fire that engine. I just hit the shift key slightly. As you can see, the throttle's just on, barely. And see, note the engine being on doesn't create electrical current. If I hit T to turn off SAS, even if there are forces acting on the craft, it would not spend electrical current. It would just tumble around. So as you're re-entering, sometimes you can get some strange torque forces. I like to keep a SAS on, but I do like to keep an eye on my electrical current. The other thing to note is if I right-click on a part, I can always click on this little thing in the top right-hand corner, and then if I click off of it, no matter what I click, that'll stay on the screen. So now I don't have to worry about right-clicking on it to see how much electrical current we have. Also, if I wanted to, I could come up here to the resources and see these little boxes here. I could click on that, and that would show me every part that has electrical current and what its value was, until I go and remove it. So we could just do that so we could see. Now we don't have any heat shield, we don't have any ablator or any of that kind of stuff. We can talk about that on another stream. I just wanted to get you into orbit and get you back to the Earth, or well, Kerbin in this case. And in fact, at this point, despite the fact that we have some fuel left, I'm going to jettison this lower section. And to make sure that that lower section does not run into us, I'm going to do a trick where I start spinning, and then I'm going to jettison it, and then I'm going to go back to pointing retrograde. Now that took some electrical current, but it also ensures that that part goes spinning off into space and should come nowhere near us on re-entry, so we don't accidentally run into it. So let's see if we can do our re-entry successfully here. Now this is a time where I might do a little time warp. Remember how I said if you're time warping and you hit the atmosphere, it'll pull you out of time warp? This is a good example of that. We're in time warp right now. We're at times 10 time warp. And as soon as we hit 70 kilometers, it should pull us out of time warp immediately. Now, when you're in time warp, your vessel doesn't rotate. So it stays the same absolute direction. Now that time warp's over, we can change our things so that we're pointing retrograde again to the orbit. In fact, I'd like to point retrograde to the surface. So I click on that. And so here we go. Let's see if we can re-enter. Now, if you're looking at the numbers up here, you can see that we're coming in at 32, but wasn't it 34 before? Yes, it was. As we re-enter through the atmosphere and the atmosphere becomes thicker and thicker, we start slowing down. Now, even though this appears to be going up, which it is, if we looked at that, we're also going up because we're coming down, but we are actually slowing down. We're slowing down in relation to our travel around the planet. We're not slowing down in our total net speed because we're starting to come down faster. It's kind of a hard thing to kind of wrap your brain around. In fact, if you wanted to see here, we could click on surface and you could see that while our speed is increasing, our angle, our trajectory is decreasing here. You can see that while we're coming in, the atmosphere is pulling our trajectory closer in. So by having surface speed up here, I can show you our vertical speed, our horizontal speed, and now this should, as we come down through the atmosphere, start decreasing. At the moment, it's still increasing. I keep forgetting we're still 62 kilometers up. We don't have a lot of atmosphere to play against right now. Now, that little wobble that you just saw, that means that the periaps has dropped below 25 meters. The reason that it does that is it's basically saying it's changing how the camera is orientated so that you can basically know when you've reached the point where it thinks you're going to land. It's not it's not very official, but the camera angle shifts. And every time I do a little adjustment here, you can see we're using some of our electrical charge. But see, look, now we're slowing down. Our horizontal speed, which is our speed that we're going around the planet, is actually decreasing, and we're still at 56 kilometers up. So we are slowing down. Now, once she gets skilled enough, we're going to get additional things up here other than just stability assist. And one of the things that's an option here is retrograde, which would be really handy right about now because I could just click on it and it would automatically keep our ship pointing retrograde. But we'll do what we can do. So you can see we're still slowing down there, but our vertical speed is still going up, but our net surface speed is going down. Now the trick here is that you really want to make sure that you're going less than about 16 kilometers, or 1.6 kilometers, or 1,600 kilometers per second. You want to be below that number before you hit about 25 kilometers up. Otherwise, you'll start burning up. Now you can see something is starting to heat up, and it looks like it's the barometer. Yep, the barometer is just a little bit into the heat stream there. Hopefully it won't burn up. Tilt a little bit so that it's not so much in the stream. And as the atmosphere gets thicker, we're creating more friction. Although friction's not really the right word for it, we're creating a compression wave, which is creating heat as we slow down. Friction is really a misnomer when we're talking about re-entry. It's what everyone calls it, but it really isn't friction. It's a compression wave that heats up the atmosphere or air in front of the vessel, and in that creating of heat, it reduces our velocity. Now, as has been pointed out by chat, the pods are pretty stable, so you don't need to SAS all the time with them, and that is true to a level. That is certainly true. I'm just trying to give a demonstration here of it. Yeah, I think we're going to lose our barometer. So now we're at 18. And we're slowing down rapidly, horizontal-wise. Our vertical speed's still going up. See, we're about to drop below the 16 mark. There we go. We're below 16, and we reached below 16 before we hit 25 kilometers. And that's important. It used to be 14, by the way. I've done a bunch of testing, and in 1.1 it was 14, and in 1.2 it became 16 because of a change in the aerodynamic effects. Now, if you're using a console, you probably still need to pay attention to the 14 figure that I used to use as my standard. But now we're going plenty slow enough, and we don't even need to worry about electrical current at this point. There we go. Now we can turn off SAS, because the very aerodynamics of this pod is going to keep it fairly stable. Now, right now you can see the main chute wouldn't go, but the drogue chutes would, and now actually all the chutes would go. So we didn't even need to do the drogue chutes, but I wanted to give a demonstration of the difference between the drogue chutes and the normal chutes here. The barometer survived! The barometer survived! We don't need a crew report here. But these drogue chutes will not slow us down enough in and of themselves that we could land safely, so we're still going to have to deploy the main chute. We could probably have gotten away without the drogue chutes completely, but we can't get away without we could get away without the drogue chutes, but we couldn't get away without the main chute. So hopefully this little tutorial that we've done today will help you people who are brand new to Kerbal Space Program and just want to get into orbit. I highly recommend that you pick up a mod like Kerbal Engineer. You can do it without Kerbal Engineer, and I hope I covered some of the basics to the point where you understand at least what thrust to weight and delta V are all about, and some of the numbers that you need to be paying attention to, and some of the basics of the Kerbal Space Center and things like that. But we'll cover more in-depth things in the future. This tutorial is going to probably clock in at just under 2 hours here, and I just wanted to put together something for people who are new to the game and might want to see something. I know there are other YouTube videos and such out there for tutorial purposes, but a lot of them have not been updated for 1.2.2, including my own. So that's part of what I wanted to do this. It looks like we're coming down just fine. Now this is a case where we're coming down at 21 meters per second. That's still way too fast for actually hitting the ground. But at 1,000 meters up, this chute should deploy fully, and we should slow down another notch. Now at that point, we're probably going to see that we're doing something ridiculous like 2.6 meters per second or 3 meters per second or something like that. And at that point, either I can time warp, which would be a physics time warp because we're in the atmosphere, or I could cut the drogue chutes. So we'll have to decide what to do once we reach that level. Probably cut the drogue chutes just so you can see how that works. So there's our at 1,000 meters up, our chute will start deploying fully. And let's see just how slow we get going here. Oh, we're actually down to 5.6, so that's actually more than I was expecting. So you can actually right-click on a chute, and you can actually cut that chute. And see, now our drogue chutes are gone, and we speed up a little bit. So now we're back up to about 6 meters per second. So if you really overdo it on parachutes, you can cut some of them, but be careful, because if you cut like the main one, you're just going to plummet to your death. Like if we cut the main one and not the two drogue would not have slowed us down enough to prevent us from dying. So Things to keep in mind, particularly since it's Valentine's Day when I'm recording this, and I wouldn't want to hurt Valentina. Poor Valentina Kerman. She looks pretty happy though, doesn't she? As someone in chat said, below 6 meters, all parts are okay. Below 8 meters, most parts are okay. But the hitchhiker storage container is not. There's another part that's also not okay at those speeds. There's some of them. There's some components that are basically designed not to re-enter. So be aware that while the 8 meter, 6 meter rule is pretty accurate, there are times when it is not sufficient. Let's do a little physics time warp here. You can see I just hit the period key, and you can see in the top left-hand corner there's 4 acceleration. And then we go down, down, and down, and now we're only 30 meters up. 20 meters up. We have a nice splash down here. And sploosh. And I don't think we've done a crew report while splashed down, so let's grab that while we can. And we still left with 36.7 electrical charge. And remember how I said once you're splashed down or landed anywhere on Kerbin, you can recover your vessel. And there you go. We got 2 science from the crew report in the water, 12 science from the atmospheric pressure scan while in space, and 10 science for recovering our first vessel from orbit. Now note, we will not get that every single time. We get that once. If we put another vessel in orbit, we don't get another 10 science for that. And that gives us a total of 54 science. Little glitch there with my overlay for a second. Sorry about that. And for our crew, Valentina gained 2 experience points and is now level 1. So for the record, anytime you put a Kerbal in orbit, they're going to get enough experience that they will be level 1. So any Kerbal that makes it into orbit and comes back successfully is going to be level 1. Doing a suborbital hop will not put you at level 1, as we saw with Jeb. But because Val actually was our first Kerbal into orbit, she's level 1. But actually, any Kerbal, not just the first, but any Kerbal who gets into orbit will become level 1. And now you can see it's nighttime. Interesting fact that a lot of people don't know that was added in a while ago. If you want to launch in the daytime or get the KSC into daytime, and you're like this right now, you can see where it's like just sunset, but I want it to be daytime. Up here, there's a thing that says warp to next morning. If you click on that, it will automatically time warp you to mid-morning the next day. How about that? Pretty handy, huh? That prevents you from having to do all those silly night launches if you don't want to. And by doing all the things we've done, we now have 300,000 Kerbal Bucks and 54 science. In fact, we could come here and we could pick up a 45 science node, or we could pick up that stability node we missed for 18. But remember, if we pick up that 18, we now don't have enough for any of the 45s. See, we only have 36 left. But still, I do recommend you pick up all 3 of these before you start picking up any of the 45 nodes. So I think that's a good place to stop for now for the tutorial. I hope that this has helped. I'll try to do a little bit of editing for it before we post it up to YouTube. But I thought that this would be a good thing for us to look at. And I hope you guys enjoyed this, and hope you have a great time playing Kerbal Space Program. And we'll stop the tutorial.